side event, Preserving Democracy and Fighting Disinformation. This side event will explore with a panel of phenomenal experts, both to my left and to my right, the impact of AI-generated disinformation with a specific focus on times of elections. We organized this event jointly, the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, together with ODIHR and with the chair of the OSCE Malta. And we are, of course, very happy to have also the high-level representatives with us. And with this, maybe I would hand over directly to Ambassador Natasha Milioti for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. However, I'm no expert, but I'm very, very happy to have collaborated with ODIHR and RFOM on this side event and on this topic, which is of great importance and one of our priorities as well as the Maltese chair. So, dear colleagues, dear participants, I welcome you. And from our part, and on our part, we think that free and independent media are key pillars of every democracy, and yet we know that media freedom is under continuous attack. Most, if not all, OSCE participating states have experienced challenges in this area. And as those of you who were there during the opening session of the conference have heard me mentioning the challenges that my own country has faced, is still facing, but foremost of which is the killing of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia almost 7 years ago, and that is, of course, a stark reminder of why it is crucial for all of us to reinvigorate our efforts to defend freedom of speech and that of the media, to defend the safety of journalists, and to never let our guards down. Recognizing the challenges we all face at the start of our OSCE chairpersonship, Malta made media freedom a priority, focusing in particular on media literacy and the safety of journalists. The spread of disinformation has become one of the major challenges to democracy and security in our region, and the challenges, as we know, are evolving. In this important election year, there has also been a focus on possible interference and manipulation of elections resulting from the spread of disinformation. And as we know, disinformation endangers our democracy and our security. It impedes access to accurate information that enables citizens to make informed choices, and it undermines the confidence in democratic processes and institutions, and it can also create polarization and division. In a supplementary human dimension meeting that was held earlier this year, as chairpersonship, we highlighted the need to invest in media and in information literacy as an important way to strengthen resilience and to counter disinformation. And in line with our priorities, we underlined the need to foster a well-informed and information-savvy citizenry across all demographics. In recent years, the capability to spread disinformation has been significantly enhanced by rapid technological advancements, including AI. And today's side event offers an important opportunity to focus specifically on the emerging links between AI and disinformation in the context of elections. We will discuss what negative effects have been observed and how these could be prevented in the future, focusing on finding solutions without limiting our freedoms. It is a great pleasure to have such a distinguished panel of experts who will shed more light on this complex phenomenon. And also with us today is a fellow Maltese, a journalist, Neville Borch, from the Times of Malta, the older independent newspaper of the Maltese Islands. And I am certain that Neville and the other speakers will enrich us and through their perspectives in the exchanges that we will have today. Before I hand back to the moderator of today's event, let me stress that RFOM and ODIHR are doing significant work to strengthen our democracies and to promote media freedom, providing the tools that we must find the political will to use. And it is very important for all our governments. And as chair of this organization, Malta fully supports these institutions and their important mandates. And we are extremely grateful to the excellent cooperation we have with all the autonomous institutions. Colleagues, in closing, openness to change, guarding against complacency, and engaging a broad spectrum of stakeholders will help us strengthen our societies. Every challenge becomes more manageable when we engage in constructive dialogue to achieve concrete results. And I thank you very much in advance for your engagement in this discussion. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your strong words. I think several keywords you already mentioned, from resilience, access to accurate information, informed decision-making, literacy, are things we will dive deeper into in the conversation today. Something I should have mentioned at the beginning, which I forgot, is that this event is being recorded. So currently you only see, or only the panel will be recorded, but if we open up for questions or statements from the floor later on, in case you would not want to be on the camera, then please just indicate to my colleagues over there who could pose the question on behalf of you if you would not wish to be recorded. So thanks again for the strong commitment from the chair. And with this, I will hand over to our representative from ODIHR, Thea Yalishvili, the first Deputy Director of ODIHR.
Thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear participants. Of course, it's a great pleasure to address you today at this event dedicated to the artificial intelligence-generated election-related disinformation, as well as the challenges it poses to democracy. Of course, I would like to start with thanking the Maltese chairpersonship and OSCE representative on freedom of the media for taking the lead for the organizing this event. And of course, our partnership, I believe, demonstrates our shared, continuous efforts and long-standing commitments to protecting the fundamentals of democracy, but also highlights the importance of our cooperation in addressing complex issues and related challenges that are spanning across several domains. As Ambassador just mentioned, of course, it follows the second supplementary human dimension meetings that has been dedicated exactly and related to these topics, such as media literacy and democracy, organized in Vienna. Dear participants, I'm really confident that these discussions today will go a step forward in assessing the linkage between media, elections, democracies, and AI technology, as well as threats that this technology poses on elections and overall functioning of democracy. All international efforts and documents produced on those issues highlights that there is and should be an ethical use of it, and that the technology development should be human rights centered and based on the principles of transparency, inclusivity, and the cooperation. The rapid development of the new technologies used in elections, of course, we think that poses challenges not only for the OSCE participating states how to regulate it, but also for us, independent observers in our observation activities. ODIHR, in line with its mandate, continues to support the OSCE participating states in their efforts to conduct the democratic election processes, including through its election observations. And our recent publication, such as guidelines for the observation of the election campaigns, is an example of our continuous support and advancement, our comprehensive observation methodology. In a conclusion, I would like to thank you for your presence and really looking forward for valuable and fruitful discussions of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the cross-organizational approach, I think, is really showcased by this conversation today. So for the first round with our speakers, you can also see Professor Elda Brogi is joining us online today because unfortunately her flight was canceled this morning, so we're very happy that we managed to still bring her in remotely. And before we go into the conversation, the reason why we together decided to have this event is really because we thought it's an ideal time now to take stock of the impact of AI-generated disinformation on elections, but also of the responses there too. And there are four kind of key things that led us to thinking of why the Warsaw Human Dimension Conference would be a good place to do so. The first one is, of course, the 2024 has been really defined as this election super year across the world. The second is that also disinformation has been defined as the major challenge to international peace, to information, and to the interconnected world that we live in. And while disinformation is not new, technology has, of course, enabled new possibilities. And we've seen deep fakes or falsified information that we will hear about later. The third one is something that we also notice is that this hype around AI has, of course, impact also on our trust in the electoral processes, our trust in the integrity of information. Sometimes, rightly, there is a distrust, but sometimes also maybe this hype is not conducive to having a democratic debate. The RFM has been working already on this topic for several years. We have, in fact, in 2021, in December, had a quite similar conversation around disinformation and AI, but that was before the hype of generative AI, which of course has changed the landscape tremendously. And the fourth point why we thought it's important to have this conversation today is because the first assessments of what the role of AI was in the elections that took place already this year was actually less bad than expected. So we thought it's really important to look at it, to explore it, what does it mean, and what can we learn from it. So with this, I would like to ask first Professor Elda Brogi, who is scientific coordinator of the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute in Florence, and member of EDMO, which is the European Digital Media Observatory, to help us a little bit setting the scene. Can you explain to us or provide a little bit insights into what are the current trends, the challenges, and the risks? Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Of course, I regret a lot I cannot be in Warsaw in person, and definitely I do hope that we can arrange another occasion soon. So my contribution today is to give a very brief overview of where we stand in terms of potential benefits, risks stemming from AI, and to flag how things are going on so far and how they can potentially be. First of all, artificial intelligence has already started reshaping the electoral landscape. It definitely has an impact on election campaign methods and election operations. Recent studies show that countries like South Korea, Estonia are at the forefront, integrating AI technologies to streamline voting processes, improve the accuracy of polls, and even combat electoral fraud through advanced data analysis capabilities. That said, when it comes to election campaigns, the information environment and the public sphere, if it still exists somehow, in the public sphere, the main risk linked to the use of AI is the spread of disinformation. The use of AI-generated disinformation during elections is probably the most significant and growing concern in this context. This involves the creation and dissemination of false or misleading information using artificial intelligence technologies. Essentially, there are two main ways to use AI to create disinformation: generating text, fake news, generating videos and images, deep fakes. Eventually, AI should also be used, is also used to disseminate such content, mainly through automated bots that can create so-called fake engagement and amplify specific content or even misleading users in their opinion formation, for instance, trolling through comments. Nowadays, there are simply much more incentives for any malicious actor to generate false and misleading content. Take, for example, the ability to mimic other styles. When you ask to write an article with the style of a specific journalist or newspaper, that becomes seriously concerning, for instance. Relatedly, there is the emerging and intriguing phenomenon of pink slime journalists, that is, outlets that imitate local news but disseminate poor quality, biased and fabricated information, which can now be AI generated. They and this type of pink slime journalism, based on the study that we carried out exactly here at the European University Institute, proliferate very much during election periods. When AI systems like ChatGPT and Gemini are not accurate, they usually attempt to look accurate by simply inventing answers. Technically, these are referred to as hallucinations. They quote statements that never seem to have been made. This is problematic because these systems tend to be perceived as accurate, and this can make users more persuadable. A concern that has been widely discussed in the realm of algorithm is bias and discrimination against minority and other groups. Large language methods can indeed inadvertently reflect and amplify the biases present in their training data. This can perpetuate systemic biases and discriminatory views, hindering the goal of media pluralism and diversity that seeks to provide diverse and inclusive representation of voices. AI system can be used for persuasion. For example, targeted advertising has been applied to nudge users towards certain political views or brand preferences, and for guiding violent mobilization, both online and offline. The use of AI can produce also a chilling effect on candidates that are targeted also with sexual deepfakes. On top of that, we have to mention the role of platforms. We all know that for a variety of reasons, in particular the network effects, meaning that the value of joining a social media network increases the more the people have already joined. In a self-reinforcing loop, the online information ecosystem is characterized by an oligopoly of companies dominating the media landscape. And these platforms have a powerful influence in shaping public opinion, especially by moderating content. And they are currently called by also the current regulation, the recent regulation, to contribute to the limitation of spread of disinformation. Just to mention the Digital Services Act under the as a European Union regulation, Article 34 and 35 of this Act on risk assessment and risk mitigation, including risks stemming from disinformation. The Code of Practice on Disinformation, a self-regulatory mechanism that will be also converted into a Code of Practice. All these instruments, regulatory instruments, can be seen as tools to limit a phenomenon, the spread of disinformation, that we must admit it's per se unstoppable. And it will be, of course, be interesting to see how those piece of legislation will be implemented in the next year. Based on recent studies, and now we go to the reality check somehow, AI-generated content doesn't seem to have swayed recent European elections. It seems that the material was more likely to strengthen pre-existing views than to influence undecided voters. Early evidence from these elections suggests that AI-generated content could be more effective for harassing politicians and sowing confusion than changing people's opinion on a large scale. On a bright side, AI can also help to fight disinformation, and notably AI can help enhance the efficiency and expediency of fact-checking processes, for example, by labeling misinformation. That said, I think we can see some dark and some bright uses, I mean, of disinformation. I must stress that, as I said, this is a phenomenon that is somehow unstoppable. It cannot be limited. It's somehow in the nature of the tool itself, disinformation itself, and the way it is spread. So I trust that the politicians, the states can find policies that are aiming to boost media that could somehow counterbalance, let's say, this sea of disinformation that we necessarily have to navigate in, including, as it was said today already, the boosting the media literacy side and the role and the critical agency of the users themselves. And on the other hand, of course, the role of trustworthy media. I was given a few minutes, so I'll stop for the time being. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elda, for really helping us to understand a little bit the situation we're currently in. I think you really excellently outlined the complexity of the issue, because it's really not only about fake content, but also, as you said, fake engagement, imitating of news, all of these different things. You also helped us to explain a bit better the terminology. What is disinformation? What is bias? What is hallucination? Which I think is important to have this conversation. What I found also very interesting is that you even question whether we still have a public space that we jointly engage in. This is a very important question. So thanks for outlining this and giving us the reality check, as you called it. On this reality check, maybe I can also bring in Neville Borsch, who is a journalist and fact checker at the Times of Malta, because of course, as a fact checker, you also do kind of this reality check that we heard about. Can you tell us what is your perspective? What are you seeing currently taking place in this space?
So, I mean, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. When it comes to the topic of today's conversation, I think the most surprising thing, I think, is the extent to which AI was not a factor in the elections, which is something that Elda already mentioned. So we've started this fact-checking initiative at the Times of Malta a little under 2 years ago now. So it's a relatively new experience for us. And one thing we were expecting coming into the elections was for AI to be a factor. And I think it's something that many fact-checkers around Europe were really expecting. I think we work with colleagues in Cyprus and Greece particularly closely, but also other colleagues at the AFP and other media organizations. And I know that AI was a very big worry coming into the elections. But what we found in reality is that how AI seems to be used so far, at least in Malta, is for the really low-hanging fruit. So these almost comical, deepfake scams, where they get an old interview of a former prime minister or of a minister or of a public figure, and they create an audio deepfake to sell some ridiculous crypto scam. These almost comical, really scam initiatives. But they haven't really yet infiltrated the political discourse in the way that we expected them to. We had a pretty turbulent European election over the past couple of months. There was a lot of political turbulence going on. There was a very important corruption case that was kind of reaching its climax in Malta. And there was disinformation related to that particular corruption scandal. There was disinformation about the electoral process. There was disinformation about who's eligible to vote. There was disinformation about how the vote takes place, these sort of things. But none of it was using AI. A lot of it was kind of using these kind of traditional techniques of sowing doubt amongst certain groups. But again, I think the most amazing thing that we found was that AI was not really a factor in the election at all, to be honest. And I know that many of my fact-checking colleagues from around Europe were equally surprised by this. Obviously, there are exceptions. I know that, for instance, in Slovakia, an AI deepfake was particularly problematic in terms of swaying the election there. And just because AI hasn't yet been a factor doesn't mean it won't be in the future. So I think we need to be vigilant. We need to keep our eye on the ball. And the unfortunate reality is that the people like us doing fact-checking and combating disinformation always tend to be a step behind the people creating disinformation. So there's kind of this constant game of catch-up, both in terms of the tools we use to combat disinformation, and as well in terms of how long it takes us to latch on to false narratives and misleading narratives that can be potentially harmful. So I think it's a challenge for us. Like Elda said, disinformation is not new. It's something that has been going on forever, and I think it's something that will continue to invade our public discourse for decades to come. But it's up to us to really be proactive in tackling it, and I think the fact-checking initiatives that many of us on the panel here are part of are crucial to these efforts.
Thank you so much for this assessment. It's interesting to hear that you think that traditional tools are even more important, but also maybe that AI is not generating so much, but used to spread these existing narratives in a kind of more precise or hyper-targeted way. The second point that I think is very important that you made is that we need to be vigilant and we need to be prepared. And something that you pointed to, and I think Elda also in her presentation, is that it's linked to some of the challenges that we see overarchingly in our current digital information space. So something that is often referred to is that the information ecosystem is in disorder right now because of the platforms that we heard from Elda and some of these factors. So with this, I would like to move to Lucy Purdon, who is founder of Courage Everywhere, and ask you kind of like a twofold question. On the one hand, now we heard AI potentially was, or gladly, was not as impactful in a problematic way as we had feared. But from your experience and from your research, was it the same for women and men, or was there potentially a gender component to that? And also, if you can link it to this information space captured aspects, and how is it linked to the role of big tech more generally?
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. The sessions today have been amazing. I've learned so much. My name's Lucy. I'm founder of Courage Everywhere that works on gender justice and technology, but I also wear another hat where I work on the impact of technology on elections, and I'm currently working with the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. She's going to do her thematic report to the Human Rights Council next year on elections in the digital age. So there'll be a call for submissions about that, so if you're interested in that, come chat to me afterwards. I'd love to chat more. So the question I've been thinking about when I've been working on technology and elections recently is, what does AI-generated disinformation add that's new to the landscape? And, as we've been hearing, it's the deepfake threat had not materialized as we thought yet. It's mostly being used to kind of discredit opponents, which is not a new political tactic. But, deepfakes are now very much part of the disinformation landscape, and we have to be vigilant to that. But they do pose a real threat to women. They are used as a weapon, part of the tools in the toolbox to silence and persecute women, especially journalists, human rights defenders, and politicians. And we heard in the event this morning on women environmental defenders that a lot of these journalists had suffered from intimate videos being released, and the deepfake kind of landscape is very much geared towards that for women. There's quite a stat that's quite well used from a report by Security Heroes, which says that 98% of deepfakes are pornographic and 99% of those are of women. So this is very much a target for women, especially with a high profile. In the UK, in our election recently, we elected the highest proportion of women to Parliament, 40% this year, and many of those women were victims of deepfakes, including now our Deputy Prime Minister. So we could do a whole session on this, and I hope we do at some point. But, I think broadly we can see over time how this threat could get a lot more serious and particularly impact women, but also really chip away at the information ecosystem. The Europol Information Lab predicted by 2026, up to 90% of content online will be AI generated, not necessarily disinformation, but AI generated, which is kind of interesting of the feedback loop of information that we have online. But I think what is new is this impact of AI generated disinformation on electoral processes. This is definitely something to be vigilant about. Disinformation is really effectively spread in my country especially, at a local scale, you know, through community groups, Facebook community groups, WhatsApp and Telegram groups. You know, it can go from I've lost my cat to I have a free sofa to asylum seekers are trying to groom children in like 3 posts. So it's kind of really gets dropped in there. And you can kind of see how this can happen very easily with the electoral process. So AI-generated content can very easily use local dialects, minority languages. This is very much a global you know, a global problem to spread messages that the polling station is closed or the polling station's on fire, don't vote, you know, don't bother going out and voting. Also, I've seen quite effective images of ballots in a ditch, you know, so you can see how that would be posted on a local group in a local context and how quickly that could spread, especially through these closed community groups. So on the face of this, there has been an attempt by AI developers at some guardrails around electoral disinformation after the tools have been released, which is quite frustrating that they've not maybe tested this before. So OpenAI, who you know, released ChatGPT and DALL-E image generator, they've imposed a few guardrails that you can't make images of real political candidates. Midjourney, another image generator, said earlier this year that you can't use prompts to make images of Trump or Biden, but in the Indonesian election earlier this year, General Subianto fully rebranded himself using Midjourney in a very strange kind of avatar cartoon, wearing a bow tie and a cuddly cap. It was very odd, but that was all used, you know, from a freely available image generator. And then you've got Grok, the generator from Elon Musk, which had no guardrails when it was released at all, and now has some. But this is kind of, you know, that AI developers are kind of new to this scene, but the platforms are not new to this. You know, the big tech platforms, and you can see that they are backing away from anything to do with political content and paid for political advertising because it has been so toxic over the years, especially around Cambridge Analytica. So, for example, TikTok doesn't allow any paid for political advertising on the platform, but TikTok is where you'll find all of the politicians. So there is definitely political content. And then Meta said that they wouldn't be recommending political content to users, but this really impacted civil society's ability to get out information about elections and about the electoral process. So the question has now become about amplification, I think, through online platforms. What gets amplified and why? And this is a question that researchers have been asking for a long time and trying to get information. Why do you see these posts and not these posts? So the transparency of the recommender systems, you know, is something that needs working on, and we can come to regulation that might help with that later. But also the fact that the big tech business models really incentivizes extreme content. And the focus has always been on dealing with this extreme content on content moderation tools. So trying to take down these bits of content by reporting to the platform, which was really sidestepping the actual problem of the business model in the first place. And really, I think that the states have kind of discovered that it's easier to spread disinformation online than it is to try to censor by trying to get platforms to take down content. So it's, you know, so exhausting to combat disinformation and to fact check, because amplification is really powerful and it's really stacked against us because of the lack of transparency and really hampering research efforts. So it's a very interesting moment in time. Like Julia said, 2024 is this bumper election year. There's a lot of tech regulation coming into force, not just in Europe, but around the world, coupled with this rise of AI. So there's a lot of work to do and a lot of things to test. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing the examples. I think this is very useful to really found our conversation into the reality check maybe that we heard about before. A few things that I think are really important is that if we speak about any sort of assessment, we have to, of course, have this intersectional approach and really see what is the potential and the real impact from a gender perspective, but also on local communities and how AI impacts this. It was also very important that you made this point that safeguards are only introduced later on after tools have been released. So I think this is something that we will also dive further into and when we look at recommendations and what also states can do better to mitigate the challenges. And you mentioned an important point that AI might be, or these AI tools might be new, but the platforms, of course, aren't. And you said amplification is really the key question. So when we look at this platform architecture and the business models that you mentioned on kind of boosting content that is extreme, there is, of course, a very big conversation on the impact this has not only on lies and disinformation, but also on hatred, on online violence. And we know that this will not be solved by content moderation alone. It's not about the individual piece of content, but it's about the structural issues, right? So with this, it would be very interesting to hear from Sarah Egan. You are head of policy and partnership at the Center for Countering Digital Hate. If you can explain a little bit more this impact of these structural challenges that we heard about, and how disinformation and lies are linked to hatred, and the impact this has on elections and access to information, forming of opinions, etc.
Yes, thank you, Julia, and thank you, everyone. It's kind of tough to be the last panelist because a lot of the things I was agreeing with from Lucy and Nelda there. But I want to bring this back to, so the Center for Countering Digital Hate, we're based in London, Brussels, and Washington, DC, and we were founded primarily, and I think this goes back to this conversation of our social mores, our ability to agree on politics, where we debate things, where we find news, are all in these online spaces, right? And the rules which govern them are both opaque, and the bosses from those platforms make decisions that they're rarely held accountable to. And so a lot of the discussion, what Lucy just brought up in terms of the platform's promises and policies is really important when it comes to AI, because a lot of the time, the policies that we're proposing, that we're discussing, you could remove AI from the sentence and it should still apply to tech regulation. A lot of the policies that we're pursuing here should have happened to social media companies, and in Europe, yes, there is regulation for it, but they're American companies that are held unaccountable in their own jurisdiction. I want to give two examples, and I'll bring it back to hate in a second, but actually, since Midjourney was brought up, so CCDH produces original research on the tools, and we test both the capability of those tools and their dissemination on the platforms, and crucially, whether or not platforms are making good on the promises they make to the public, to regulators, to journalists, and how we can hold them to their word. So in March, we did a piece that we called Fake Image Factories, where we tested 160 prompts around election disinformation, voter disenfranchisement around the US election, and tested whether Midjourney, ChatGPT, Dream Studio, the top image creators would create those images. So they made things very easily. So President Biden sick in a hospital bed, a convincing image of that. Votes being dumped in, let's say, in Pennsylvania, where I'm from. President Trump in jail. And our researchers were able to make convincing images very easily. Midjourney, these big platforms, then made those Munich agreements on voluntary commitments around election disinformation and how they would safeguard our elections this year. We tested after those Munich agreements, and they still continued to create these images of candidates. It's so easy that, Midjourney will say you can't make an image of President Trump or President Biden, right? You can do older white Republican male playing golf, and you can guess what image is created for that, right? What I think is important here, and in part going back a bit on why we didn't see this come to fruition in this election cycle, is we tested this for voice generators as well, and unfortunately they were not. Fortunately, the bias of the platforms means they're very difficult to create European voices when we tested politicians. They were very good at Macron, they were good at Rishi Sunak, Biden, but when it came to asking if they could do, Donald Tusk, for example, they can't get the accent right, and that's part of the embedded bias. But that's our Midjourney example, right, on not keeping to their promises. I want to go also to the dissemination side of it, which is X. So CCDH was sued by Elon Musk last year for documenting the rise of hate speech on the platform, and as a result, advertisers left. And while that case has been dismissed, it was a real moment where we have seen Musk has ripped the Band-Aid off for what platforms can get away with without intervention, right? So Grok AI, the AI image generator that is embedded into X right now, we tested 60 prompts on there. Hateful images of African Americans with racial stereotypes. images of violence at polling places, things that are already illegal under existing election codes, right? Threats to a polling place, other attacks on voters, and all of the prompts that we tested were accepted. So, and Musk himself, we've documented, since the beginning of the year, has done a number of election disinformation-related, like misleading claims, so accruing up to 1.2 billion views just on those posts. And so when the owners of these platforms are able to spread disinformation and hate in the way that Musk has, they set the tone for the way that we are able to have discourse on these platforms. What is the norms and acceptable ways that we can speak to one another on there? And we're seeing that descend on X. I'm worried about other platforms. And on hate, these things are very much linked to one another. What Lucy was just talking about in terms of the ways that deepfakes impact women, we are seeing in similar ways that image generators were, discriminatory in the way that they portray candidates that we had tested. A lot of the biases that we see in our society are embedded within the tools we have created. And what I think is crucial, and we'll come back to this on the regulation, is the transparency for researchers to be able to access and see where these images go. So we did all the creation. It's difficult to find where they are disseminated to because platforms are so opaque in order to find, which posts are most viral. Meta shut down one of the biggest researcher access tools right before the European elections this year, CrowdTangle. And without that tool, it's more and more difficult for us to be able to do the work in order to see what the impacts will be from AI-related disinformation. And I'm sure we'll return to that, but I might be over time.
Thank you so much. I think this was the perfect transition already to kind of what should be done if you kind of point out that the opaqueness and the unaccountability are really the key issues in the conversation that we have here. And another point that I think is very important is that you pointed to voluntary commitments are really not enough. And this is something where I think we can also learn from platform regulation, where for many years there was this attempt of self-regulation that has clearly not worked out. And now they're the same voluntary commitments when we speak about AI. We have only about 20 minutes left, so I also want to, if there's still time, give possibilities for urgent questions or comments, but we will also want to really have the time to hear from all the speakers on what can we do now. So really not only trying to establish what are the current impacts and potential impacts in the future, but also looking forward how we can overcome this weaponization of the information spaces. But as there was a super eager hand already now, maybe we can start with you and then also integrate it into the second round of hearing how we can address the challenges.
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Veronika Laputska. I'm a media expert and I work also as a social media analyst at election observation missions with different organizations. I'm very happy that Sarah was the last one because actually I wanted to make a comment that we haven't come across US elections yet. So I think it's a little bit maybe over-optimistic to say that AI didn't have that much impact. So, but hopefully we're wrong and nothing will happen. And I have two questions. Last year when I was working in Africa, I encountered instances of AI creating fake journalists, like AI-generated journalists who were producing news which were problematic for elections. Have you maybe in your countries encountered anything like this? Because we know about, of course, AI-created images of politicians, but what about media? And my second, I think, very important question, so maybe we can integrate it also to other answers, is that are we working on like deeper cooperation with the platforms? Are we establishing more trusted partners with the Meta, with X and so on, so that they can also somehow cooperate on putting down AI content, which is disinformation, of course, related content on platforms? Thank you so much. Very great.
Thank you for the question. Is there anybody else who wants to pose a question now? Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, Neil Holland, UK Ambassador to the OSCE. Super quick question. I think a lot of, it's about incentives that are on offer to the social media companies. And the fact is that this is profitable for them to do this. Until it no longer becomes profitable or it is regulated out of existence, they'll still do it. So my question is, can you break the link between the profitability of the model and the abuse that takes place online? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have, the first question was still a little bit on kind of like what we see with regard to fake media or journalistic content, but then I think both questions on the cooperation with platforms and how to overcome the challenges with the incentives fit very nicely into the second round, where I would ask you to tell us what your perspective or like suggested policies are to mitigate the impact, but also to avoid the challenges in the future. And maybe we can go the same order as we did before. And Elda, I will give you the floor first.
The very large online platforms are already somehow involved in this, let's say, fight to disinformation, or in any case, they are asked to put in place some measures in order to limit the spread of disinformation, at least for what concerns the European Union. Before I was mentioning the code of practice of disinformation, that is a self-regulatory tool that aims at asks the platform to commit for some practices and behaviors in order to limit the spread of disinformation, including, for instance, an element of a request of trying to avoid disinformation to be paid. I mean, so there is a commitment that speaks about demonetization of disinformation. So the incentives the economic incentives to disinformation should be definitely limited, and disinformation shouldn't be a business. And of course, there is also a pledge for avoiding that disinformation is a business for the platforms themselves. It's true, the platforms are gaining, are receiving their incomes, the revenues on attention. They monetize attention. So if fake news is popular, definitely they have an incentive to disseminate it. That said, the European regulation tries to limit this trend, and in general make the platforms more accountable for what their services disseminate somehow, how their services work, and what kind of content they are disseminating. Whether it is enough, I don't know. And we'll have to see in the long run, because this is a regulation and a self-regulation, on the other hand, when it comes to the code of practice, that is still not fully tested so far. It's a regulation that is very expensive to be implemented, both on the side of the platforms, on the side of the regulators, and of the stakeholders that somehow have a say in implementing the rules themselves. In my humble opinion, we have to invest in trustworthy information. Maybe we can rethink of the role of journalists, fact checkers, and try to invest more in this kind of again, information that can somehow mitigate and work as much as possible as an antidote to the virus of disinformation. Yes, this is my take. So
Thank you very much for underlining also the need of this mix of regulation and self-regulation, demonetization, which I think is an important point when we speak about profit and incentives. Neville, what would you add from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question really strikes to the heart of it. I mean, what is the incentive for these online platforms to combat disinformation if they're making money off it? I don't think there's a clear answer. I mean, I think regulation does exist, but clearly it is not functioning and it's not being enforced to the extent that it needs to be. A few months ago, the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, which is kind of a network of fact-checking organizations around Europe, published a study looking into the take-up of fact-checking initiatives by online platforms, and what they found essentially is that they're virtually non-existent. So a couple of these online platforms do have collaborations with fact-checking organizations. Meta, for instance, has a fact-checking program. But in most cases, it's paying lip service. So there doesn't really seem to be the will to really strike at the heart of the spread of disinformation. And I think ultimately it is because either the disincentives aren't strong enough, or because it's really not worth their time to invest in combating disinformation, because what's in it for them ultimately? So I don't really know if the answer is stronger enforcement, if it's better regulation. What I do know is that what we can do in the meantime is focus more on media literacy, which I think is a big part of combating disinformation, because disinformation spreads much quicker and much more successfully where media literacy is poor. So I think this is kind of another side of the debate that we need to look at, because media literacy is a crucial tool in combating disinformation. And while we do need regulation and we do need enforcement, this much is clear, because the Digital Services Act is a good step, but it probably doesn't go far enough. But then on the other hand, we need to also focus on our efforts on media literacy and on helping people really discern what's true, what isn't, how to be more critical in what they read and the information they consume, what constitutes a reliable source and what constitutes a source that isn't reliable. I think these are all things that are crucial to the fight against disinformation.
Thank you very much. I think this is really important to underline kind of like what can we do on the individual level and what can we do on the structural and collective level, and it needs to be a combination of both. It's also important to really focus on enforcement. I think this is an important point, because very often we speak about regulation as if it would be the end and the solution of everything, but of course we have to look at the enforcement. Lip service, I think, is also an important keyword, that we also have to make sure that the commitments are not accepted as they are, but there needs to be the research and the fact-checking of the initiatives that are actually happening and taking place. Something that I think is also interesting that you pointed out is that there might be different steps or points in time. So I think we have to find the solution for short, mid, and long term. This is also something we discussed previously, right? That we have to find solutions. What can we do now for the US elections that you mentioned, for example? What have we learned? What can we apply now? Mid and long term, of course, literacy efforts, but also the important point that Elda made on reinvesting in media is, of course, something that we would subscribe to. But maybe Lucy, please, what would you add from your perspective?
Thanks. I'm going to try and tie this all together. So breaking the profitability of the model, literally the billion-dollar question. And yeah, it's one to ask the advertisers. You know, if the advertisers stop the dollars coming in, we've seen how annoyed one particular platform only gets when that happens. But this is a real question for the advertisers. This is how the tech platforms became so rich, is because they had this incredible targeted advertising model. It was so successful that obviously political parties looked at it and were like, yeah, we'll have some of that. If you can convince that person to buy a sofa, I would like you to convince this person to vote for me. So that we saw the build up of that. There was a tipping point with that, with Cambridge Analytica, and now you see the platforms really backing away, cutting off that part of their business, which was very profitable. So maybe part of it is like this sort of tipping point. Are we going to get to this point where actually this disinformation is just too much, and actually we're going to look at other things? In parallel to that is investing in alternative unprofitable advertising models, particularly privacy-preserving ones. So I know even Meta's looking into this, so it must be pretty bad. But I know Mozilla, where I used to work, is also like really looking at privacy-preserving advertising, which is really cutting down that stem of personal data. So that's one aspect of the model. The other aspect of the model is this amplification problem, where to keep people online, you show the most extreme content and the algorithm kind of runs away with itself to the point that no one's really sure how it kind of works anymore, sort of slightly lost control of it. So it's really important in kind of the enforcement question that we're talking about under the DSA and others to really support researchers in having this access and not letting big tech firms cut down these avenues as has been happening with CrowdTangle and for X's access to their API as well. The ones to watch really are the DSA enforcement decisions that have there's a lot on the table at the moment. Decisions will start happening. One big test of the DSA was the election guidelines that the European Parliament election, so it was really this test. There's research now coming out from civil society about how this has been going. And I saw a report the other day, and I forgot who it's by, but it was about TikTok and how TikTok's access to data for researchers was not good enough. But it seems like from the report that there was this good back and forth and there was improvements and there was this willing to learn. So kind of hopeful on that aspect.
Thank you very much. I guess that it's a perfect kind of combination. It's about regulation, but it's also about reputation, and it's about the different actors that need to play a role. Not only traditional actors, but also advertising is a crucially important point. Sarah, you spoke a lot about opaqueness and the need for transparency before. Can you maybe pinpoint to that what could be a way forward, but also anything else you would want to add on the recommendation looking forward side?
Yeah, I mean, actually back to the first question around, what is going to happen to media figures or other people impacted by the AI bits. If the most visible candidates in the world are still having deep fakes and clearly are able for them to enforce policies on, I do worry a lot about down ballot races, what happens to a normal person if it happens to them who don't have the resources. I don't have a great answer on it, but they are failing on the most visible ones. And so there's low-hanging fruit for them right now. And I mean, going back to what you were asking me, Julia, which is, for me, the business model made Mark Zuckerberg $100 billion, right? He's not going to easily give up that business model. They will have many slush funds for regulators. They're the richest companies in the world, right? They're able to put money aside and say, this is how we'll pay our regulatory fines as the cost of doing business. And so for us, the solution has been, well, first of all, on advertisers, it's not for them to withdraw ads because that can be useful, but it is a bargaining chip for them to say, we all believe that, our democracies are important and that lying about elections or election disinformation is not something that's acceptable for their ads to be next to. And they are well within their rights to ask for platforms to enforce their rules on hate, disinformation, and the rest of that, right? So advertisers are able to use their bargaining chip in that way, in the same way civil society can, journalists can, agencies who receive ad credits also have their own weight there as well. On regulation as well, like I said, sure, they can throw a lot of money at this, but I do think it is about enforcement and how the regulation is going to consider researcher access. So that opacity that I'm talking about, we just mentioned TikTok, right? We did a study on TikTok 2 years ago where we found the algorithm feeding, eating disorder and suicide content within 39 seconds of joining the platform as a 13-year-old girl. TikTok, in response, then revoked the ability to look at hashtags about eating disorders that we had used in the report. So that happened because of publication and researchers' ability to get traction in the media. And for those who care about, media expression of researchers and the ability for us to, hold these companies accountable, I think the third and most crucial part of this is access for researchers and empowering the media to be able to have the information they need to hold them accountable, right? Bad PR is what makes Mark Zuckerberg squirm. Advertisers withdrawing is what makes him squirm. European regulation, right? He'll send a letter saying he doesn't want to comply with the AI Act, but he will have to if shareholders and advertisers are angry that their ads continue to appear next to election disinformation.
Thank you so much. So the three key takeaways, at least for me, is the important work of researchers, fact checkers, journalists, to really be able to better understand it. The second point, I think that you all pointed out that it's a collective responsibility to preserve democracy, right? So all the different actors have to work together and to fight better. And then the last point that I think is particularly important to emphasize, at least from the perspective of RFM, is this call to reinvest in quality media and to really make sure that there's better availability and accessibility to public interest information. It's clear that a 1-hour discussion is not enough to have this conversation, but before closing, I would like to hand over to our director, Philippe Tromblot, to kind of close down the conversation, and thank you again all for your important contributions.
So thank you, Julia. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Natasha, for the chair, and Thea for Odir for this excellent collaboration on this topical issue, and some of the examples, especially the 39 seconds that you just mentioned, that's really incredible. But anyway, no more time for a question. I'm just curious if there was an algorithm, clearly somebody created this, or how was it? Anyways, that may be a part for a session next year. But let me make just a few more key points. First, disinformation poses major challenges to our democratic societies, as truly democratic election integrity hinges on information integrity. And while disinformation is not a new phenomenon, we heard today plenty of examples of how new technologies, in particular AI, clearly complicates existing challenges and raises new risks. Second, it's crucial to further assess the impact of AI on disinformation and democratic elections. So today's conversation was very useful in identifying these existing arms and potentially looking at future avenues or solutions. It's clear that we need a multi-stakeholder, holistic, and human rights-based responses to disinformation and to technologies that facilitate the undermining of our democratic values and foundation. And one thing that came back again and again and again, and that RFOM works on, is media literacy. And I think this is extremely important. We're developing guidelines. We work with our support program unit in Ukraine on that. So this is an important strategy, as well as the provision of support to quality journalism, the advancement of availability and accessibility of public information interest. This is really important to reinforce the link between freedom of expression, freedom of the media, security, and democracy. So thank you very much, all of you, for this, and thank you for sticking with us until the end, too. Thank you. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to also thank Dali and Vladimir, who are here, with whom the cooperation also worked very well on the working level. Thank you to the excellent contributions, and especially to our 4 panelists, Lucy, Sarah, Neville, and Elda. And thank you all for staying around, and wishing you a lovely evening still in Warsaw.